Cooperation of SeeAudio, Crinacle, and Hi-Fi Go. Wow, this better be good. Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Now, what we have here today is just usual set of in-ears, but maybe not so usual after all. These are called Yume Midnight. Midnight is like addition or revision, because there is like a normal Yume model. And I didn't hear that one, so I cannot tell you what is the difference and what is the scale of that tuning, that cooperation between the manufacturer, which is SeeAudio, which I really like, and actually I'm currently using their more expensive in-ears called Bravery. Those are my all-time favorite in-ears, but these are slightly cheaper at $199. And these are cooperation between SeeAudio, Crinacle, I think it's pronounced that way, that's like a reviewing website / YouTube channel from recently, and Hi-Fi Go, which is an online retailer that actually sent this review sample to me. Thank you for that. So to get the necessities out of the way, yeah, they come in box, they have different ear tips, 6 of them. They're silicone tips, pretty nice, everything's okay. There's a carrying case, it's a hard one. There's like a rubbery sealing ring here. And that's it. There's a cable. The cable is good. It looks silvery. It's not tangly. It's not much microphonic, at least I didn't notice that. Hooks are pretty nicely done. They're not those insanely tight curly hooks that you have to melt first. These are nice. Fit, at least in my case, is also great. I feel they can reach and settle securely without rubbing at any other part of the ear. So at least for me, ergonomics and fit gets high grades. And sensitivity of these is good. They're sensitive, you can drive them with basically anything, you don't have to worry about that. So we can now talk sound. So first thing that I noticed is that Yume Midnight is definitely a slightly V-shaped sounding in-ear, because it has quite a bit of bass. There's decent amount of bass emphasis. It has some higher mid-range and high frequency emphasis, and lower mid-range feels retracted, a little bit depleted. And I think, at least so internet tells me so, that most listeners actually prefer this type of tuning. When it comes to in-ears, it seems like most of us don't like perfectly flat tuning because that sounds a little bit lean. And we don't like mid-range to be as prominent as with our speakers because we put those inside of our ears. If mid-range is really prominent, everything will feel like it's wow, right in front of us. And we like to create some sensation of space, of something a little bit further away, and that's why this tuning is applied. Anyways, you can definitely hear that. And especially in the bass line is really emphasized. It's heavy, it's weighty, it has really decent amount of sub-bass, that rumbly part. Also a lot of just normal bass and upper bass, they're quite bassy. And in doing that, these definitely lose a little bit of quickness and speed, and also a little bit of texture compared to some of the best in-ears at this price point. And if like sheer amount of bass and its weight and rumbling is something that you look for, these are great. If you're more into speed and texture and highly agile notes, these might not be the best for you. Mid-range is really detailed, but as I mentioned, lower mid-range is somewhat depleted. So don't expect vocals to sound really full and lush and intimate. Both male and female vocals sound a little bit pulled away from you, like further away, slightly thinner, and I don't find that to be a problem necessarily. If you are all about full, rich, warm vocals, it might be. But as I mentioned, that actually creates a benefit too. It pulls vocals and most of the instruments slightly further from you. And because of that, you have a sensation of bigger space than you would otherwise with completely flat sounding in-ears. But a payback for that is that those vocals and those instruments are not tonally rich. Their timbre is not as full and as lush as with some in-ears that have that lower mid-range slightly more filled. Then highest frequencies, again, really detailed, really resolving on a slightly brighter side. These definitely feel airy, bright enough. They light the soundstage and events quite okay. But as I mentioned, they are slightly emphasized, and I wouldn't pair these with overly bright and analytical sounding pieces of gear, because I think you might have a little bit too much of that hotness in that part. When I mentioned pairing, I also wouldn't pair them with overly bassy sounding DACs and amps, like some Theos, for example, that I know, because then I suppose you would have that really emphasized bloaty bassline. And at this moment you're like, stop telling us what you wouldn't do, what would you pair them with, you maniac? And I'm like, okay, from all of these DACs that I have lined up here, let's quickly go through them. I want to be you too, a little bit too hot for my opinion for these in-ears. So just a little bit overzealous in that upper frequency part. DH80s Hidizs. Really nice in the upper section, but bassline is a little bit warmer and altogether this sounds a little bit bassier than I would like. Caen RU6. Pretty decent match. Good, rich tonal balance, rich mid-range, that's good for vocals with Yume Midnight. Nice, softer, but still open highs. Again, really nice with this. Bassline, weighty, full, a little bit slower with these in-ears than I would ideally like. So that leads me to Beam 3 Pro. 150 DAC that I really liked, and when I reviewed it, I said I think it's a mid-range centric DAC. It has really rich mid-range, lots of details, lots of dynamics, and the bass line that's quick and nimble and wiry and textury, but not that weighty. Perfect match with these. I think best in my opinion, because it puts just the right amount of grip and control on the bass line. It emphasizes those vocals and their richness a little bit. It makes vocals and mid-range instruments sound quite nice, and it doesn't emphasize highest spectrum, so it doesn't sound too hot. Ideally, I would like the bass line to be a little bit more controlled, but there's nothing you can do about that. It's not about DAC, it's not about pairing. These just have really elevated bass response, and it is on a fuller but slower side. You might as well really like that. I don't mind it, but as I said, ideally I would like it to be just a tad bit more controlled and tamed. Because as it is, I definitely call it bass heavy. And that leads me to comparisons. First of all, Moondrop Kato, that are not at the time with me, but those are quite comparable technically speaking. Moondrop Kato is a little bit more shouty. It has a little bit more of that echoey, shouty feel to the mid-range. While these, Yume Midnight, have more of a dryish character. Vocals feel more dry. Also, Midnight feels somewhat airier, and it feels like it has a little bit more of that high frequency information. Whereas Kato is slightly rolled off, slightly maybe more liquidy sounding, with that slight shoutiness that I actually prefer because it makes vocals sound more liquidy. And the bass line is quite similar. Both are elevated. I think Yume Midnight maybe have more of that sub-bass rumble than Kato. I might be wrong. I'm not really a bass head. But these are quite comparable. And I think it would boil down to your own personal preferences. Do you like this slightly airier but drier sound? Do you like something that's a little bit fuller sounding as Kato, maybe a little bit shoutier and slightly more rolled off? But Kato does feel like everything maybe is even a little bit farther away from you. And some of you will say that's great, that's more spacious. Others will probably say, yeah, they sound more tubey. But I think they're quite comparable. Next one, 7Hz Timeless. These are 220, I believe, and I'm not sure that I can untangle them at the moment. But these are planar in-ears. And they're highly resolving and very speedy. Now, if you compare them directly to Midnight Yume here, you'll notice that 7Hz Timeless has more controlled bass line. I feel it has better control, it's quicker, and it has more texture overall. That said, exactly because of that, these do have an overall leaner sound signature. And mid-range is more prominent, and higher frequencies, because bassline is tamer, feel more prominent. All of the edges and textures will feel more up there in front of you. And sometimes if I listen to, I don't know, my favorite female vocals, I would think like, yeah, I definitely prefer this. I hear more of details from their vocals. I hear more of everything, like how their lips move and things like that. But after a few songs, I do realize that this type of sound can become a little bit tiring, a little bit quicker, and that this emphasized bass line and slightly retracted mid-range, even though I don't prefer it at first, can actually be preferred after a prolonged listening. There's not much to it really, that's basically it. If you want to put emphasis more on that upper parts of the spectrum, both mid-range and higher frequencies, and to feel that transients are more pronounced, that texture is more pronounced, that vocals are closer to you, and all instruments, if you listen to acoustic instruments, like pluck of the string feels a little bit more energetic and edgy and closer to you. And I say immediately, wow, that's nice, I prefer that to this. But if I start listening to lesser recordings, something like, let's say, rock of the 70s or music of the 80s, things like that, I quickly notice that that kind of high frequency information retrieval can become a little bit tiring, and actually this warm and deep and emphasized bass line can make a lot of songs more enjoyable. Even though I don't really prefer it when something is ideally well recorded and full and fat and with dark background, when it's not, Yume Midnight provides a sense of comfort and easiness of listening that really can be good in some situations. And finally, just for the kicks, I compared them to more expensive SeeAudio Bravery. These are 280, I believe, so some $80 more. But I can definitely say that it shows. These, to my ears and in my opinion, have more accomplished, more mature tuning. Mid-range is more prominent, it's fuller, while the bass line is quicker and slammier, and overall these have better dynamics and better separation between instruments than Yume here, or Timeless or Moondrop Kato. it's not really a fair comparison, but I just wanted to mention them so you do know what else you get if you decide to step up and maybe purchase an even more expensive model. And as I mentioned, SeeAudio Bravery is actually my favorite in-ear, the one that I'm personally using and carrying around with me. From the moment I've tested it, I really loved it. And I hoped maybe that Midnight Yume will be able to match it at a lower price point, but it cannot really. It has its own tuning that's basically like V-shaped, prominent highs, prominent sub-bass and bass in general. They're quite bass heavy. And if you like that, they're quite okay. They are technically accomplished, they resolve a lot of details, and if you think you would like that, then yeah, I suppose this could be like a pretty decent solution at this price point. Because at that price point, I cannot find in-ears that I would recommend and tell you like these are better. Timeless does something better. Kato does things a little bit different. But I wouldn't say that any of these is inherently better or superior. They're just different. And it's up to you to choose among all of these great candies that we have lately on the market. Just choose the flavor and which one do you think is the sweetest one for you. And that would be all for today, guys. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.